All right. Okay, well, thank you everybody so much for joining us today for our noon session, one of many of our CTLE webinars that have kicked off this week. I'm Melissa Jones, and I'm excited to be facilitating this conversation for us. And I wanted to let you know that you are welcome to use the chat at any time. My goal here is just to share some ideas, to maybe give you some inspiration as you're thinking about planning your courses this semester. And any ideas that you have, if you share them in the chat, if you would like, I can always take a quick break and let you share your examples too. So if any of these ideas really speak to you, feel free to put them in the chat, and then I'll be happy to turn the floor over to you to share some ideas and some different strategies for creating more dynamic discussion boards. The focus of this particular presentation, I've tried to look at it from the perspective of someone who would be teaching in a face-to-face or a synchronous class. However, all of these ideas are rooted in best practices in online learning. So I really think that this translates across many different types of modalities. So I will focus primarily on how you can incorporate these dynamic discussion boards into your live classes, but feel free to use these techniques for any type of course you're going to be teaching. As I put together the outline for this, what I found is that I had divided it into 3 basic sections, and all 3 of those sections had 7 ideas or talking points. So I have affectionately subtitled this presentation 21 for Fall 21. So we will go ahead and get started. And I wanted to take a quick look at our agenda for today. So in our time together, we're first going to look at the purpose of using discussion boards from an educator's perspective. Why do we use discussion boards, and how can they be used in effective ways? The majority of this presentation will focus on some ideas and some strategies for creating more dynamic discussion boards, ways to increase engagement and really create a collaborative space for your learners that supports learning, connection, community, and critical thinking. And then finally, I have a couple of tips for designing and implementing and assessing discussions, which can sometimes feel overwhelming as we're looking at the amount of posts that are coming into our courses. So I want to give you some tips there for working through your assessments as well. So we're going to get this started by asking you, what's your purpose? Now, that may seem a bit existential and a bit spiritual for noon on the Monday of August here. But really, what we're looking at is, what's your purpose for using discussion boards? So if you take just a second and think about why you incorporate discussion boards into your own classes. Perhaps it was because you had to, or you thought that may have been the right thing to do for your classes. But what we really want to look at is, what's the purpose of them altogether? They are a staple and a hallmark of online learning. And what we're going to look at is, how can we translate those same skills into our face-to-face classes as well? Essentially, when we look at why we use discussion boards, we have 7 reasons. The first one is to learn more about our students. In a face-to-face class, if you have 25 students joining you for the day, it's very difficult to learn a lot about each of the students. Discussion boards provide a static place for students to be able to post their ideas, their thoughts, make connections, and it really helps us to better understand who they are as people. Discussion boards can also support critical thinking. By having a discussion board where other students are seeing the posts of their peers and a view through your responses, we're able to help them develop some critical thinking skills and critical communication skills as well. Discussion boards also add some structure to our learning process. When we think about our lectures, our group projects, our materials and content, the discussion boards can really be a place that adds the backbone or the foundation to our course. And I mentioned in an earlier conversation today that I saw this great headline in an article, and it said, as we prepare for the fall 2021 semester, and we think about all of the different variables and the way we're in a bit of an uncertain time, one of the things we can do is to move our headquarters to online. And I really believe that the discussion boards are able to support that, so that regardless of how we're teaching or delivering our content, we really can put the headquarters of our class in the online environment, so they're there for support. Discussion boards also give us the opportunity to assess student understanding. Now, we have our learning outcomes and our goals for our courses and our objectives, but really what the discussion boards do can be on an even higher level when we look at how our students understanding and working through ideas and concepts and the materials we're providing. Discussion boards also give us a place where we can scaffold concepts that have a lot of complexity to them. Discussion boards can be basic conversation pieces, or they can present very complex ideas. And by scaffolding these throughout the term of our courses, we're able to support our students where they need it the most. And then at the heart of discussions, it's really an opportunity to provide a collaborative experience for our learners. Whether they are talking in class or if they talk through different channels of communication, one place that we can always provide them the opportunity to discuss with their peers and learn from each other is on the discussion board. And what this does is essentially fosters community and connection for our students. And we know, especially now, that community and connection are going to be very important as we move forward. Students need to feel as though they're a part of their class community, of their university community. And one of the ways that we can foster that is through this sense of connection on our discussion boards. So these are some of the reasons why we use discussion boards. It's not just a place for students to post ideas, but it's also a place for connection and community and for helping us to understand how the students are working through the learning process. So as we do this, let's look at some ideas for creating more dynamic discussion boards. And again, if you have done any of these, or if you have different takes or models based on these, please feel free to post it in the chat, and then we will share those experiences as well. Our first look and your first tip today is going to be to use discussion boards in a way that create a welcoming and inclusive environment from day one. As Dr. Vox said, as we were talking and we were getting started, students are eager to come back, students are eager to see each other, and students are probably pretty nervous as well. And so the discussion board can be a place where students can take that time to reflect before they join the class or after that first class, and they can see their sense of community developing around them. So thinking about something like our traditional icebreakers. So for those of you who have taught in face-to-face classes, does anybody have any icebreakers that you really enjoy doing on the first day? What are the ways that you connect with your students on day one?
I usually ask them, how did your summer go? Or how did your, time off, or something from right now, they have done many things most likely, and then they get, and then something specific. What are the reasons they have chosen this class, if this was an elective, and something like that.
Great. So reflecting that personal connection that we see, and then also making the connection to the course. Absolutely. And then I see Laura has put in the chat there, the 2 truths and a lie. So all of these are great ideas. Let's see, Christina, we have coming up with draw a picture, something that they did over the break, and then we use that picture. I love it, bringing in some creativity and some artistic looks at this to see if they can figure out what they did by drawings. And celebrity interviews, great. Okay, these are excellent ideas. So one of the things that we could think of as we are progressing and moving into this new form of teaching, we also see, let's see, Joe has said here, the best part of the summer, worst part of the summer. So these are all ways that we naturally are trying to break the ice in our classes. Sometimes, though, that can take up quite a bit of our class time. And we know how important it is to build that sense of community from the very beginning. So one option will be to move each of those icebreakers into the online environment where students can post to the discussion board. So rather than the students specifically coming in and then talking in class with each other, you could ask them to post on a discussion board in a very traditional icebreaker format so that the students can then see each other's posts as well, and they can think a little bit more about what they're going to say. I think we've all been in environments before where we were asked to introduce ourselves and we're not really paying attention to the people who are speaking before us, because what's happening, we're starting to think about, what am I going to say? How am I going to reflect on my own summer or my own ideas or why I'm here? So sometimes that sense of connection can be a little lost when students are put on the spot. So one idea would be to move your traditional icebreakers to the discussion board. Now, If you like that idea, but you still really have planned out your day one to be a sense of community amongst your students face to face, one of the things you could do is add in a second element of this. And this is where we may do their traditional introductions in class face to face, but then there is a follow-up activity that comes on the discussion board before the next class meets. So an idea for something like this would be to pose questions or ideas and reflections on the syllabus. I know oftentimes we spend quite a bit of that first day of class going over the syllabus, but we really want our students to be able to process that information and to think about the questions that they may have regarding assignments or the pacing of the class or our course policies. So one way to approach that would be you can still do your traditional icebreaker face-to-face, but then assign the students a discussion board where they post questions, ideas, or reflections on the syllabus. This also helps with the number of questions you get that are repeating each other. This way, students can already see if some of their peers have the same questions as they do, and then look a little more critically at particularly what they're looking at in the syllabus. This is also a great space to help support student learning in terms of sharing plans for a successful term. So perhaps your first discussion board could ask students to outline what they need to do to ensure that they have a successful term. You could narrow it down to specifically your class. You could ask them on a broad picture, what is it that they're planning to do? How will they stay ahead? A lot of different variations on this particular way of approaching it. Another look would be something like the community agreement that Flower Darby did last week during Faculty Development Day. I think most everybody who's here in our session today was in Faculty Development Day last week. And what a great idea was that with the community agreement. So there's a shared sense of community amongst all the peers. It's clear how you're going to create the environment that you're wanting, what the expectations are, and that the students can post what their expectations and goals are and how they're going to contribute to the community agreement. A discussion board provides you the place to let students see all of those ideas coming together. And it's nice because it's something that you can refer back to all throughout the semester. In class discussions, that's one of the points that we lose, is because we can't always go back to what was said. But if the community agreement is placed in the discussion forum, we can always return to that at a later time. Another idea for your first discussion board would be core values. Asking your students how the core values reflect parts of themselves, who they are as learners, as people, as citizens. By having them connect to the core values, they'll feel that sense of community with the university as well. And it gives them a place to really reflect on their ideas, and they don't have to feel as though they're put on the spot to come up with those ideas right in class. So those are some great ways to create that welcoming environment. So we look at why we would do something like this, especially so early in the term. One is that this frees up some class time. Class time is very valuable, and there's going to be a lot of questions. And I think a lot of people are building in some time for reflection this first semester as we try to navigate these new terms. And so thinking about freeing up a little class time to focus on the ideas and the concepts you want to speak on, and then asking the students to complete those activities outside of class time. This also gives students the ability to process all of the information. It can be very overwhelming for our learners when they come in the first day, especially right now, coming in with all of the new policies and questions and concerns that they have. So by building out a discussion board, it gives them time to process and ask questions that have a little more depth and a little more development to them. Discussion forums can also give you the opportunity to explain your process and your expectations for the discussion boards. This kickoff discussion board can be a way for you to look specifically at how you're going to shape discussions throughout the term. What are the expectations? How will students respond? And it removes that stress of being put on the spot in the moment to have to answer some of these questions that really could support reflection. And then finally, with this welcoming environment that we can create on day one, we also can support retention because students are writing out these ideas. So any of these are ways to kick off the class to really get started with kind of a dynamic discussion that is then able to perpetuate the rest of the conversations in the class. Now, our second idea, and this is something that can be very effective as we are looking at what do we want our students to know as they join us in class throughout the semester. With students coming into class unprepared, which we see sometimes, we want to think about what particularly could we have them do ahead of class so that the conversation, the lecture, and the discussions are a bit more focused. So one way you could approach that is to ask students to post questions about your particular topic ahead of time. Now, this would be where they post questions before class. You could review them, and then that way you can address any of the questions that come out during the class time as well. So this helps us in a couple of ways. First, it allows the learners to share what they already know about a topic. This is especially important when we look at adult learning theory and the students that want to show that they do have some understanding of the topic. But it also lets us know what they don't know about a topic, any misconceptions they have before we begin our lectures or our in-class material. Posting those types of questions will help you as the professor be able to gain these insights so that you can lead the in-class discussion in a more focused way that addresses questions and possible concerns or misconceptions that can come up sometimes with some complicated topics. A third way to look at a spin on that same idea, to prepare students for class. If you've ever been in a class where students haven't completed the readings or the materials ahead of time, this is one way to support that they will finish the readings and that they will have a basic understanding of the concepts you're going to be discussing in class. And this is by asking students to post any sort of questions, ideas, or responses to the readings and materials before class. This way, when you come into class and you start talking about the concepts and asking for feedback and discussions to happen in class, your students will be more prepared because part of their assignment was to post ahead of time. You can set these up as early as possible in your courses. As you're thinking about the outline and the framework for your course for the rest of the semester, each week you could start with these types of questions where students are asked to do the readings and then respond to the discussions online. Now, what's interesting about this approach, and I've tried this both ways, is that it helps get the focus there and it helps to reinforce reading the materials ahead of class, which is something most of us want to do. And with this, you can ask them simple questions such as share the key takeaways from the readings. Post any kind of questions that you have about the readings. One of my favorite activities is to look for other sources. So whatever your topic is, perhaps you want your students to do a little more research on that. Have them share out the additional sources that they have found on the discussion boards. This creates a repository of ideas and of different resources that your students can use. And it shows how they're able to apply what you're talking about in class outside of that into very practical applications. You can also ask the students to look critically at the assigned readings. What do they think are points that they are in favor of, or what points are they unclear on? Does the information that they're reading seem to conflict with anything that they've read before? These types of discussion boards posts can really open up the conversation for you for your in-class time. Now, with replies, something to consider is, will you ask students to reply to each other before class or after class? With something like these conversations, especially once you get into very complex topics that students need to grapple with a bit in order to really understand the content, one of the suggestions is to have them post their initial post or their initial responses ahead of class. Then after class, that's when they can come in with the replies. That should help them develop their responses to each other. And I've even seen situations where students will go back and they'll elaborate on or discuss problems with their original post. This really helps to support that critical thinking because they're able to have their initial ideas and then your influence and instruction, and then go back and revisit their original post. So all of this can be done in a way that will support and work alongside your face-to-face or synchronous teaching as well. Our fourth idea is to look at roles and using discussion boards to assign roles for collaborative projects and for group work. So there's a couple of different ways to approach this. With your discussion boards, not everybody has to have the same role. You may not want all students to post and respond to your original post. You may want some students responding to each other. There may be a variety of different prompts that you're going to use. But one thing that you can do is you can assign roles, and we can mean this in a very traditional sense. For example, 1 week, students perhaps will be an original poster. So they're the ones who post the prompts or the original responses. Then you can assign some students to be the respondents. These would be your students who go in and respond to those original posts by their peers. And then even something like a researcher, as someone who could go in and read the posts and the responses, and then a person can be tasked with the responsibility of going out and researching that topic, whether in your own course materials or outside of that, and bringing it back in. This could be something that could be set up very easily early in the term, and you could have a rotating calendar where people take on different roles. And of course, this is something you may not want to do every time you have a discussion. Instead, you could think about what activities that you have where students really need to be able to take on these different roles to fully grasp the concepts. For those of you who use authentic assessments and case studies, consider the use of personas and taken on roles. So an example of this is from one of our education classes, and in the way the course is designed, one of the topics is looking specifically at the financial ramifications of a school investing in certain educational technologies. The original discussion post may have asked the students to think about all of the different angles and how we could approach something like that. By shifting it to using personas and moving it into an authentic assessment, the students could be assigned different roles. Perhaps they're members of the school board, maybe they're parents, perhaps they're teachers, they are people who are working for the educational technology companies. What's happening in this scenario is that your discussion boards now become a place where students can think critically about all of the different people who are involved in decision-making processes. The same thing can happen depending on how you are approaching your different lessons and what your topics are. But something like authentic assessments and case studies work very well on discussion boards. Let's see, we do have, want to draw your attention to the chat here. Georgina, would you mind sharing with us a little bit about your roundtable and the live sessions and how that's been helpful?
Yeah, so what I do is the discussion question for that particular week, when I have the live session and we're synchronous, the students that come to the live session, I say we're going to do a roundtable, and then I bring different approaches to the discussion question, and then they choose like for example, a code of ethics principle that could be aligned to what the discussion is. But what I found is it also helps students who really don't know how to start the discussion or provide their thoughts. It gives them the opportunity to engage with each other, and then they gain ideas, and then they go off and they, are able to develop really nice discussion posts because they were in that roundtable discussion.
Wonderful example. Thank you so much. And this idea of these roundtable talks they can be really, really effective, and they can be done quite well through something like discussion sharing, and whether it's live or if you're hosting an asynchronous class, a lot of different opportunities there for students to be able to come in and take away these key points. And then we have one other suggestion with roles, because roles can be defined so broadly here. Thinking about projects, if you do have any collaborative or group projects in your classes, one of the places where you can facilitate those conversations and not take up class time, or also to be more inclusive for your students who may not be able to be in class, is use a particular discussion forum specifically for planning and working through their projects. So this way you can see the conversations happening in pretty much real time. And you can also look at this from the different roles that they're going to be taking in their projects. Perhaps there is, in your project, there is the group leader, there's the person who is recording the notes, there's a person who's going to be presenting. By looking at those particular roles, you can use a discussion forum and able to support those conversations with students. And it's all in a nice kind of controlled space where the students don't have to go out to other sources, or they don't have to come up with their own ways and their own technologies to use. You can provide all of that to them right in a discussion forum. So not all discussions have to be graded. You can think about using them really as a spot for communication. And that can work really well, especially for group projects. Our fifth idea, and this goes so perfectly with what Georgina just added, are using fishbowls or jigsaw techniques. Now we're going to talk about those, but before I do, has anybody used either of these techniques before? A fishbowl or a jigsaw, whether it's face-to-face or online? See, Candace, thumbs up. Is this something that you have used before?
Yep.
Any insights or ideas you wanted to share with everyone from your own experiences? Anything they need to think about as we approach this?
I've used the fishbowl, but I actually like the inner circle, outer circle activity a little bit better. You know, with the fishbowl, you've got 2 or more people inside the fishbowl having this conversation discussion, and then people on the outside who are observing, taking notes, making observations, depending on what tasks you've given the outside people to do. And that can be pretty dynamic. It does put people on the spot. And so I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it depends on the dynamic of the course and what your expectations are and so forth. But it can really generate some fascinating conversation, especially because the outside people aren't just passively sitting in the class watching somebody else answer the questions. They actually have tasks to do during that fishbowl, and then they may have to elaborate on what went on, evaluate what went on, or whatever, but they have to be actively engaged. So that is really effective. The inside-outside circle is when you have 2 circles, one inside the other, and the inside circle is facing the outside circle. And every member of each circle is communicating with the person in front of them with some task that you've given them, whether that's, you know, discussing their takeaways from an article, or, you know, whether they've come with a, you know, an evaluation of something, or peer review, whatever it is. But then after a certain amount of time, one of the circles stands up and moves to the left, and then they get a new partner and start over. And that really generates a lot of conversation. And you give them a very limited period of time, so it's fast. It's kind of like speed dating and discussions. And then jigsawing, I mean, maybe somebody else could provide an example. I mean, I can provide one, but I don't want to spend all of your time.
See, I'm checking our chat here.
I can describe the jigsaw. I teach it all the time as a social psychologist, but yeah, okay, the breakout rooms, that's good. Yeah, I'm disorganized a little bit, which is why I'm nervous about it. But basically the idea is it's actually a diversity and inclusiveness activity as well as a learning one. And what you do is you have a bunch of different groups, say, and it's a lot of K through 12, but obviously we can use any of those things in, college. But basically, say you have 6 topics on Abraham Lincoln, and one of them is like the history, and one is like his family, and one is like the political things that he dealt with. And so each group is supposed to study those topics, and then each of those there's an expert at each one of those tables, and the expert will go to the other group's expert tables. There's like a table for each person who's looking at his family, and an expert the table that's looking for some other topic. So basically they go away, they become experts, and then they come back to their own tables, and they teach their section until they have a complete family history of Abraham Lincoln or whatever. So that's kind of the basic idea of it, is that they go and then they come back, and the diversity aspect of it, and kind of like the social justice aspect, is that students of color, girls, people who have traditionally, back when it was created, would all have an opportunity to be an expert and to look competent, because a lot of times there's a lack of confidence makes you less confident, and then you look less competent. So that's the idea, is that everyone comes back and everyone is dependent on that person for their input. Does that make sense?
Perfect.
That's a great example, Laura. Well, I think one of the ways I found jigsawing to be a lifesaver for me is, in a couple of my classes, I just kept adding articles and articles. I'd find another one. It's like, oh, this is great, I'm going to have them read this. Oh, this is great, I'm going to have them read this. And so on a given topic, I might have gone from 2 articles to 6 articles. And it just got to where it was going to implode if I kept doing it, but I wasn't willing to give up some of the other articles because they were so spot on. So I ended up jigsawing them. So you know, 3 students might have one article, 3 another, and so forth and so on. And then they would come back to class, and then we could jigsaw that out, or we could have them, you know, be the expert in their other groups. And that was a great way to sort of divide and conquer.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing that. And I wanted to give everybody the opportunity to see how some of these happen in classrooms and what it is that we're looking at when we talk about fishbowls and jigsaws. So as we think about moving this into the online environment through discussions, we want to think about how can we adapt these practices that are effective and really support diversity, they support critical thinking. What would that look like if we were to incorporate something like a discussion board? So as our discussion moved forward, we saw that the jigsaw is really a cooperative learning technique, and it has these home groups and expert groups. So we have the students go out and they become experts in a certain topic, and then they come back to their home group and share out what they've learned. And then the fishbowl technique, as Candace noted, has students that can be looked at in terms of inner and outer circles. So when we think about these techniques in a classroom, we see them used with a lot of movement. Perhaps what comes to your mind is thinking about students moving all around the classroom. But as we prepare for fall 2021, we have to really think about what can happen as far as the logistics of a classroom and how can we be prepared regardless of what happens in terms of our delivery and our certain types of modality. So thinking about the discussion forums, if you were to set up a jigsaw, perhaps in a discussion forum, what we could see is that the students could have their home groups. So they're all working on a particular project. But within those home groups, then they have to go out and learn more. And this is what Laura was saying, where with Abraham Lincoln, maybe somebody needs to know the historical significance, and somebody needs to know a personal information, and someone needs to understand the legal concerns. And so each group then could review or take part in the expert groups in the particular discussion forums before they go back to their home groups. So if you are delivering content in a face-to-face or a synchronous class, you could set up the expert groups in the discussion forum, let students communicate and share ideas there. So then during class time or during the live sessions, now you can move the students through breakout rooms or through physical movement around the classroom into their home groups and let them share out so that each person has that opportunity, as Laura said so perfectly, to be an expert in that particular idea. What the discussion forum can do is can support that so that you're not spending as much class time with the particular groups. Instead, you're honing in on specific things that you want to accomplish during class. Now, with the fishbowl technique, or looking at it from inner and outer circles, as we consider discussion forums each week, perhaps that's some of the roles that the students take on. One week, maybe they are assigned to be observers of the conversation that's happening on the discussion forum. And then the follow-up to that could be that then they reflect on it or add in information after they've had a chance to observe the conversations that are happening in the discussion forum. So it gives everyone an opportunity to consider the information through a text-based format rather than live in class. So it opens up that possibility of being flexible with both of these different techniques. And to go along with that, our sixth idea is to structure and classify the types of responses that you want in your discussion forums. And I'm going to give you two different ways to look at this. We saw for a long time that people were concerned in terms of discussion forums because students tended to say the same things, or you felt like the information they were just searching for and then regurgitating it and putting it back in the discussion forum. But instead, what we could do is provide a little guidance, a little framework for how we want our discussions to happen. This first one is from Jennifer Stewart Mitchell, and it's the 3CQ method. And the way she designed this is that in discussion forums, there are these 4 different types of activities that can happen. You can compliment. So for example, you read a post and say, well, I like that because, and explain it, of course. This helps us with those students who tend to say, oh, I agree. This asks them to then explain their compliment. You can comment. I agree with that, but I disagree because. This asks for a different level of critical thinking and examining the content. They can show a connection. I also thought, and then elaborate on that idea. Or perhaps their role in the discussion is supposed to question. I wonder why. based on the feedback that they're seeing from their peers. Now, with Jennifer Stewart Mitchell, she suggests that all discussion posts should have at least 2 of these per post. And I really like that idea because it provides the students with a little bit of structure. And I believe it was Candace who mentioned that sometimes students, they can see the discussion forums as a bit intimidating, but this provides them a little bit of structure. Now, this next idea is actually Alan Zhang's work. And it's really fascinating how this came to be because he did a ton of research where he did some data mining on discussion forums. And this goes along with the gender of the posters and the grammar and structure of their content. And what he did is do a deep dive into how people tended to respond to each other based on some of those questions. So, for example, one of the things that he did find was that students did tend to disagree more often based on the gender of the original poster. We also saw that we see more disagreement in situations where students have a lot of grammatical and structural errors in their post, which is really fascinating to me, is that other students tend to disagree with them, not based on the content, but on how the posts are written. But from all of this research, a really interesting framework came to be about how we could guide our students to respond to discussions. This could be something that would work really well in classes where you are talking about critical issues, you have topics that have a lot of complex angles to them. And with John's work, what we see is that students can agree, but agree and provide evidence, or agree and elaborate on the ideas. So they can take any of those 3 different forms of agreement, but then they have to continue them with the but, the evidence, or the elaborate. And the same can work with the disagreement statements. So students can disagree with the content or the logic or the particular approach of an argument, for example, but then they also have to develop those responses with but, with evidence, or with elaborate. So this particular structure could be a really great way for those of you who are working with complex topics to have students kind of work through some of these ideas. And it moves us out of this structured debate where it's right and wrong or where there are winners and losers. And instead, each one of these methods really focuses on how we can look at the different angles, how we can be more critical in our approaches, and perhaps how we can also work on some form of compromise or understanding, at least, of the different sides. So these are a couple of ways to approach that. And then last, for our 7th point here, one of the things we want to think about is how you can provide options. Discussion forums do not have to be these places where it's just a lot of text. There are different ways for students to respond, and there are different ways for you to post prompts, for example. So a couple of things to consider is offering different prompts. What we see a lot of times is that there will just be the one prompt for the week, and the students will have to all respond to that prompt. Mix it up some. Give students the ability to respond to different prompts. That will help them respond to the questions that they are most interested in, and it will provide you for a lot more of an interesting read on what the students are writing. So consider posing a few different prompts for the students, or as we saw in some of our other examples, have the students post prompts for each other. A lot of different ways that we can approach that. Support different types of posts. Not all posts have to be fully summaries or critical thinking posts. Sometimes they're there just to answer questions, to form connection, as we saw with something like group work, but also as a place to curate resources and ideas, to share out other information. So consider what types of posts you want. Perhaps students do want to share something visual, or maybe they share out a podcast that they think is especially relevant, or they share out their project plan. Any of those things can really be facilitated in a discussion forum so that you don't have to go outside of D2L to support learning that's happening outside of your class. Consider audio and video feedback. Do know that in D2L, when you are posting discussions or when there's feedback, when there's prompts, replies, D2L does have built-in video and audio feedback. And our team in the CTLE can help you with that if you have any questions with using it. And I do want to address, last week, a question was brought up in a different webinar about the length. And D2L has extended the length and the storage capacity so that your video or audio feedback now can be up to 30 minutes. So these conversations can be video or audio, and they can be right in the discussion forum. So for students who feel as though they would rather talk into the camera and explain their ideas, they're welcome to do so. For those who prefer text, that's still an option as well. So these are also things to consider as you're putting together possible ways to incorporate the discussion forums. Thinking about requesting videos, asking students who perhaps have done their own group projects or they have recorded presentations, have them share out their presentations or their videos there in the discussion board. The same can happen with any sort of videos they find. Videos can be embedded directly into the discussion forum, and it can really keep the conversation going, and you can ask students to respond to each other's videos as well. Considering the role of curating resources, this could be especially beneficial when students are working on different topics and how that they're connecting their ideas and sharing out their resources. An easy way to keep track of all of those resources that they share would be in the discussion forum. And then finally, sharing images. The discussion can be a very dynamic place in terms of different types of media. So remember, all of those types of posts can be shared, and sometimes the images are exactly what we need to see in those discussion forums. And then I'll turn to the chat here. I saw a message. So Cynthia is asking, how does the video feature differ from Flipgrid? It's a different platform. With Flipgrid, you're going to have some different features. For example, you can have different filters. You can post things a little bit differently there. And then students can respond right there to the video. So there will be a video post that shows up very similar to how we look in Zoom, actually. If you can imagine all of us just being static pictures right now, you could click on my video and then you could respond with your video to my video in Flipgrid. You can do the same in D2L. It's just not going to be quite that same level of video capabilities. It's very much you turn on the camera and you hit record. There's not editing features. Those types of things aren't there in the same way that they are in Flipgrid. And the students do keep in mind that with D2L, with the video, you do want to make sure that they have really strong internet connection as well. So Flipgrid just ensures that everyone is using video and audio, whereas in D2L, students have the option of the type of feedback. They can add a video to a discussion post. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I've been considering experimenting with Flipgrid and just trying to weigh the pros and cons of, well, just using the video feature in D2L, and then, you know, that would give students the option of whether they wanted to type the answer. I use discussion posts in all my on-ground classes, and I have been doing that for several years now. But I do like the option of encouraging them to use videos. And I was thinking maybe Flipgrid would be the way to do that, but that has to be a separate place they go. It's not, you can't use that within the context of D2L. Am I correct in that?
Actually, Flipgrid can be embedded into D2L. It can be shared out through your D2L shell so that they are recording. It basically goes into a frame in D2L, and so they can record right there without having to leave. They have the option to, which to me is a benefit of Flipgrid, because the students, for example, if they have their phone, they can go to the Flipgrid app and then they can record there as well. But you, as the faculty, the professor of the course, you can embed Flipgrid right into your course. So it's a good option. It's absolutely a good option.
How do you do that? How do you embed it? I mean,
Sure.
Is that a separate thing, or can you embed it into the discussion board?
You can set it up as how I've always set it up is as an assignment in particular, but you can also use it in the discussion. It pretty much can go anywhere in D2L, and we'd be happy to show you how to do that.
Okay, I would be interested in that. It
Oh,
maybe
sure.
that should be another webinar, but
Yeah.
But I would be very interested to know more about that.
Sure, absolutely. We can do that. I know we have talked about having a Flipgrid session soon, so we'll do that. And then just for anybody who's in the group today in this conversation, we can email you out instructions as well for Flipgrid in particular. So that way you can go ahead and get started on it as we plan our webinar on Flipgrid.
Oh, that'd be great. I would really appreciate that.
Sure, sure. And I would say, just as you are trying to determine if you want to use the video feature or if you want to use Flipgrid, what I would consider is, do you want most of the responses to be video and audio? And if so, if that's really what the purpose of your assignment is. So for example, I know Candace uses Flipgrid for peer feedback. And so in a situation like that, Candace, do you want to explain a little bit about how you use Flipgrid for peer feedback?
Sure. I teach a course on writing and how to teach writing, and I feel really strongly that the participants should know what it is to be involved in a peer group in order to model that for their own classrooms. So everybody, they have about 5 pieces of writing during the term, and each piece of writing they have to take to their peer group to get feedback, and then I give them specific things that they have to do that week. So they might have to find 3 things that they liked, 1 suggestion, 1 thing they want to know more about. So everybody has has something specific they're looking for in order to provide feedback. Otherwise, you just get, oh, I loved it, and it's all so general and not very helpful. So I set up a grid for each group. And then the group goes into that grid, and then I can go in and observe. I always go in and post something to start with. I actually start the term with a introductory. They all introduce themselves via Flipgrid, so they have a little bit of experience with it. And then anyway, so each week they have a writing task. They post the task in the discussion board because I want people to be able to see the writing, because for some people listening to it isn't enough. They need to be able to see it while the person who did the writing actually reads it into Flipgrid. And so they can follow along. It can all be done asynchronously. And then the reviewers, after they've heard the piece read, give their feedback. What I found, and I the first few times I ran it, I asked the students, so would you prefer to do this in the discussion board or Flipgrid? And after the first week or 2, they are all in. Their responses are so authentic. I have the benefit of being able to actually go in and check and make sure that they're on task, because when you're in an on-ground class, what's going on in all the different groups you can't necessarily hear or monitor. So there's this sense that, okay, whatever I'm saying is kind of being recorded and I could be viewed. And so they're a little bit more, not only on task, but I think they're more invested in it. And but their responses are really heartening. To listen to them provide feedback to each other and nudge and encourage each other is really pretty cool. And of course, as with all peer feedback, they learn a lot in the process because they see examples in other people's work that they can ultimately replicate in their own way, or non-examples. And so they're getting a really good critical eye. But Flipgrid's been really great for me for that venue.
So if like, for example, that what I'm considering using it for, all of my students in the UE classes have to write a little essay on the role of music in their life. And that happens, the very first week of school. And then I use that information to assign them a research topic. I try to match their research topics with their own interests and their background. And I thought, wow, well, that could be a really perfect Flipgrid type of an assignment where they basically give a verbal recorded introduction of themselves. And that way they could actually give examples if they wanted to. They could go a little bit more descriptive than they typically do in an 800-word essay. They just look at that differently. And I was, in my online classes, of course, that is a discussion board. In the on-ground classes, it's typically an assignment post where they have to turn it into an assignment folder. Would you use do you put the connection to Flipgrid into the assignment post? Is that how it works, or?
I generally create the grids, in advance, and then each group uses that same grid throughout the term. So
Okay.
If I was just doing it as a one-time thing, it would just be create one grid, and you can post the link right there in D2L. And we can help you set that up. That's not a problem. I could see that being a really cool assignment. And what's really neat, I think, is when students actually, what my students said in terms of whether they would rather use Flipgrid or the discussion board was that they really connected with their peers, hearing their peers read their writing, hearing their peers talk about things that mattered to them was so much more real and authentic than the reading. And we also know that students, they don't always read. And so when they have to read somebody else's work, they're skimming, they're finding a thing or two, and that's it, but they're much more dedicated to it. But you do have to keep it reasonably short. And you can extend the time on Flipgrid. I think originally the Flipgrids were only like 30 seconds, and then you could expand them to 2 minutes. And I think it's much longer than that now. But it also teaches them to be succinct. But I also give them the option of, look, if you didn't finish, just post a second video and they'll just run side by side. And then they just go to the next one to listen to the rest of it. So there's really not a limit.
Okay. Okay.
Except you don't want to watch hours of these. So you do want to limit it in that regard. And with the peer feedback, I don't watch every video in every group. Once I get them started and I do an occasional comment here and there, you can't read all. And it's too, at first I felt really guilty about it. I was like, gee, I'm like cheating. I'm not really watching all of them, right? But I do read every one of their pieces of writing. And but adding on that watch time really took a lot of time. And once I saw that their interactions were so productive and so positive, I did not feel compelled to watch every one of those videos.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for sharing those ideas as well. It's always a great way to think about different ways we can explore these tools that we have and in a way that makes the most sense for our classes. So as we move into this final section of our discussion here, I wanted to share a couple of tips with you as you think about navigating, creating these dynamic discussions, because they are a bit different than those traditional discussions where all the students read something and then respond to it. So here are a couple of pointers just to think about as you begin considering how you can incorporate more dynamic discussions into your classes. First, make sure that your expectations are clear. This can be set up very early on in the course. Examples work exceptionally well for discussions with what you're expecting and how you want your students to respond to these particular types of discussion forums. So just make sure that there are clear expectations, and especially with something like Flipgrid or with video feedback, you can always model that. You can record yourself through the video feedback or through Flipgrid. The same thing if you are asking students to find some resources to share or to post questions. Those first couple of weeks in any course that has discussion boards are essential, and they are key in terms of how you're going to set the expectations for the rest of the discussions in the class. And as Candace mentioned, and I see Gianna mentioned it too, assessing all of this, the great thing about discussion forums, and this is research informed here, evidence informed, is that you can back off as the semester progresses. Your presence in these forums should be very visible in the first couple of weeks, but after that, once the students are in the swing of things and they understand the expectations, things can run pretty smoothly and you can take on that role as an observer. A second tip here is to think about what your role is going to be. Are you going to be coming in and explaining ideas? Are you going to be addressing questions? Because there's nothing worse than when students post questions on the discussion board with the thinking that you're going to come in and answer them and then you don't. So make sure that that's clear. Are you going to be an active participant in the discussion boards? Are you going to be addressing questions? Really, what is your role going to be? And a great tip for this as well is that even if students don't go back into discussion forums to read them, a weekly recap. So at the end of the week, once you've had a chance to read the discussions, posting an announcement or during your class time, taking a few minutes and then recapping the highlights and any questions that were posted in the discussion forum. That can save you a tremendous amount of time. You don't have to feel like you need to respond to every post because you can do a wrap up and address questions at the end of the week, which is another way that helps you to connect to the students, but also in a very smooth way too. We can think about examples, how the examples are going to work throughout the semester and in modeling those particular types of behaviors that you're looking for on the discussions. With this fourth idea, one of the things that we can think of is how to humanize this experience. We want students, so thinking about different types of media, our video, our pictures, using authentic assessments, using those roles and strategies that we talked about, where students can understand how to apply what they're learning in class in this sort of authentic experience that makes it all feel a bit more human. And recognizing that sometimes on the discussion forum, this is also a place for informal conversations to take place. And it's an opportunity for students to really discover different ideas and explore them with their peers in a safe space as well. With this, consider offering a token or a pass, as we have all looked at in the last year and a half or so with flexibility. One thing to keep in mind, and this is just a really best practice. Sometimes students, of course, aren't going to be able to prepare for every single class in the way we want, and they may miss a discussion or they may not be able to complete something. One way to create a more equitable classroom, rather than just saying, come talk to me if you're having problems, is to offer everyone the same type of pass or token from the very beginning. Let students know everybody has one pass or one token that they can use for the discussions, for example. How this helps to celebrate the students and to honor what they're going through is that it doesn't ask them to tell you things. So you have some students who are going to tell you everything about their day and their experience, and they're going to ask for extensions. And that's where we come in with flexibility. But for every student that comes to you with an issue, you have a student who's not going to feel comfortable sharing that with you. So keeping something like a token or a pass available to all students that may not want to share what's happening, but may need an extension or may need a break from one of the assignments, that's one way that you can build in these discussions, and they don't have to feel as something that can be penalizing to the students. It's there to support them and to create this type of environment. With that in mind, one suggestion is to take a windows and mirrors approach. So this is part of the SEED initiative. And what this looks at is with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that all discussion forums, the conversations that happen in these spaces in your classrooms, should offer students first a window into someone else's way of thinking or a critical topic, and a mirror that allows them to see themselves in this conversation and to be a part of it. So it's just something that I think is always helpful as we look at discussion forums. Have you built in a window and a mirror in your discussion forums that lets the student voices be heard and lets them be seen as well? And then finally, as though I had talked to Laura before this, my last piece of advice is to create, use, and love rubrics. So these will save you a tremendous amount of time with grading and assessing these different posts, because you now are inviting more posts and more writing and more sharing into your courses. So setting up rubrics ahead of time will make all of the difference. It will make your assessment process much, much easier as you go through this, and it will streamline any sort of feedback. So absolutely, Laura, rubrics are helpful. So create, use, and love those. As far as next steps, I'd be thinking about how you might incorporate some of these dynamic discussions. Maybe just one struck your ideas today. It's something that can be done gradually as we're working on creating our courses. Feel free to visit us on our website and CTLE website for ideas and resources. We are available for one-on-one consultations. So I know the conversation in the chat there, for anybody who wants to learn more about Flipgrid, for example, or embedding it, just send us an email and we'll get that all set up. And then finally, a little later, when we are working on our catalog for our courses for teaching and learning, we are offering course CTL 118, which is creating engaging and inclusive discussions. So quite a bit different from this conversation today. It's looking at discussion boards as a place for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I thank all of you for being here. And I will also open up the floor for any questions.
Hi, Melissa. This is Gianna again.
Hello.
In my question in the chat, I've been using discussion boards for several years too. I notice on D2L there's a way to look at statistics, and sometimes it shows you the number of posts that students have done. And so that's really what I was trying to ask in that chat question. Can you talk a little bit about how to use those statistics?
Sure, absolutely. Is there any, I know my team, some of my team may be able to speak a little bit better to this. Is there anybody on my team that wants to talk about using the stats in your classes? Okay, so let's see, I don't see anything popping up in the chat. So absolutely, Gianna, what we can do, D2L's features have gotten a lot more advanced in the last year and a half or so. And we do have access to a lot more data in terms of how students are posting. So what we can do is we can schedule up some time to look, particularly maybe at one of your courses, and we can use those statistics to help us understand like how students are posting and figuring out the best way to assess those as well.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
I'd be happy to do that. Absolutely.
Okay. Once we get into the semester and I'm not scrambling so much, that would be really great. Thank you. Great job
Sure,
today. Thank you
absolutely.
so much.
Oh,
Both
thanks for
times
joining
today.
us.
Good job.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Ed, you're very welcome. Thank you. Let's see. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Anything else?
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank
And
you, Dr.
everyone
Fox, great to see you. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording then.